Hello and welcome to the Starting Sisters series, where we go from your first purchase to your first 2,000 point army list and everything in between. In this video, we'll be looking at 3 different unit types for the Sisters of Battle army, which consist of troops, transports, and fast attack. The reason these are all grouped within one video is because each of these choices are rather shallow for the Sisters of Battle, although all of them are rather playable, though I really do hope that in the future they do expand on these choices, whether it be in a new codex or a supplement like Engine War, as it would definitely be nice to see more options, especially when you consider how crowded the elite slot is for this army. With that being said, let's dive right into the choices and see how they play. We'll begin by looking at the troop choices for the Sisters, and for this choice they only have one option, being the basic Battle Sister Squad, and seeing as most army lists will have some level of troops, you'll generally be fielding at least one of these, and in some cases you might be fielding quite a few squads of them. The nice thing about the basic Sister Squad is that their stats are rather reasonable for their points cost, and they come equipped with all kinds of weaponry as a baseline, being the bolter, bolt pistol, and 2 types of grenades. They also have quite a lot of options in terms of additional weapons, being able to pick up both a special weapon and or a heavy weapon option, which gives them a nice level of customization. However, you'll generally leave the squads with their basic loadout, as there are plenty of choices for special weapons within the Sisters army, whether that's Retributors or Celestians, both of which have more baseline abilities and even stratagems to optimize their special weapon choices, while costing a tiny bit more in points per model. Even something like the Dominions might be better in terms of carrying special weapons, and both the Dominions and Celestians build from the same kit as the basic Sisters, so that adds to the difficulty of choosing special weapons on the basic Sister Squad. As a whole, this means you'll generally run the Sisters as a basic troop choice that's decent at holding objectives and moving around the board, rather than outfitting them with special weapons, unless you have some spare points at the end of list building to equip them with a special weapon. This is definitely a spot where I'd like to see something added in terms of selection, as the basic Sisters are perfectly adequate at getting the job done. They're somewhat boring, and usually armies have more than one basic troop choice. Now that we've covered all of the troop choices for the Sisters, let's look at their selection in terms of transports, starting with the Sororitas Rhino. As a whole, the Rhino transport is rather good, as it has a decent stat line and is low in points, while offering transportation and protection for your heavy hitting units like Repressor that either need a transport or to be put into reserves, as they'll have a hard time without one of those options. While there isn't much to say about this transport choice, it's a solid pick, and in 9th edition, where mobility and board control are vital, having a low cost transport with good stats is crucial. More so, the Sororitas Rhino benefits from the different Sisters buffs like Axe of Faith and Shield of Faith, giving it a little more resilience than other transports within the game. So while the Rhino isn't mandatory, it's definitely very good to have, and as far as things go, it's one of the better transports in the game in terms of cost effectiveness. After looking at the Sororitas Rhino, we can take a look at the Emulator. The Emulator is probably a model that's a bit underrated and hasn't seen much tournament play, but I can definitely see it doing something in the future, as it's not bad at all, it's just somewhat niche. The Emulator has the same basic stat line as a Rhino, but costs 125 points baseline, whereas the Rhino is only 78 points baseline, and it sacrifices 4 transport capacity, going down to a total of 6, in order to gain some heavy weapons. Normally it comes with a heavy bolter and flamers, but it can upgrade the flamers to a twin heavy bolter or a twin multi-melta. While the multi-melta is a nice weapon, I think it pushes up the cost of the unit a bit too much, and doesn't flow particularly well with the heavy bolter that the Emulator always has. On the other hand, the twin heavy bolter keeps the cost of the Emulator the same, and essentially gives you 3 heavy bolters to shoot with, and that's rather good for the points, especially after the buff to heavy bolters, seeing as the Emulator is only slightly more expensive than 2 mortifiers, which have a similar shooting firepower, although the mortifiers definitely have a significantly better melee profile. Although the transport capacity of the Emulator is limited, the transport capacity of the Emulator isn't the end of the world, because while it can't really transport units like Repressor that want to be taken in larger squad sizes, it can definitely transport smaller squads like units of basic Sister troops or Retributor squads, which is definitely a good option to have. And finally, it has a stratagem that allows it to auto-explode when destroyed, something that the Rhino does not have. And while at first glance this is rather underwhelming, it can be rather good within a game, as you can use the Emulator as a gun platform and transport. Then once you've dropped off the units inside, you can position it as a screening unit, or simply ram it into an enemy and explode it once they manage to destroy it for additional mortal wounds. And this can go a rather long way, as an army like the Admech has a similar ability that it can use on its Dune Rider transports, allowing them to generate a lot of mortal wounds To wrap up the transport choices for the Sisters of Battle, we come to the Repressor. This isn't a widely known model as it's not very common and comes from the Forge World line. The Repressor is essentially a slightly beefed up Rhino with a melee weapon and has an ability called Firing Points, which allows embarked models to shoot out of it while being transported. And while it's a cool concept, the model is rather high in points for what you're getting, and for a little more you can pick up an Emulator that comes with its own heavy weapons and doesn't need units embarked to have good shooting. Additionally, the melee weapon isn't particularly great either, as it's not bad against infantry or swarms. Thanks to gaining additional hits against those types, it still only has a limited number of attacks, which makes it far less impressive, and if the Repressor is in melee range, then the embarked units can't shoot out of it with non-pistol weapons, which really hampers its selling point. As a whole, it's not unplayable, but I'd generally stick with the Rhino or the Emulator as they seem much better in terms of what they get for your points. And to wrap up the transport selection, I would say this much: while the Sisters don't have a particularly impressive transport selection, not many armies do, and in this case they actually have a pretty good set of options. That the Sororitas Rhino is a very powerful but low cost unit, while the Emulator is a little more high cost but gives you the option of taking a heavy weapons platform that's actually a transport, so it is not limited by the rule of 3. And finally, the Repressor is just kind of something that exists. I'm sure someone can find a use for it because it's not outrageously overcosted, but it's definitely one of those units that I look at and just kind of shrug my shoulders at. I don't really think that the Sisters need anything in terms of transports, as really once you kind of have your basic Rhino style transport and one that's like a little bit of a flavor transport, you're pretty much set for the most part, as you're usually going to stick with the lowest cost transport simply to provide your units with a bit of protection and mobility. As such, you're probably going to see a lot of Rhinos in games thanks to their ability to really help out the Repentia, though you're very rarely going to see something like the Emulator. However, it is very playable. And the Repressor, even though it has a 10 unit capacity, you're going to see it even less because any small squads like the Retributors, which would benefit from the firing points, can just as well benefit from an Emulator, which comes with its own special weapons. While units like the Repentia that want the larger transport capacity, they can't really benefit from the firing points as they don't have ranged weapons, so it's rather confusing as to why you would want this unit. And while I think it's a cool concept, I think this is one that can definitely get reworked in the future. After the transport selection, we come to the fast attack choices, with the Sisters having only 2 of them, though both are rather playable. The first fast attack choice we'll look at is the Seraphims, who are rather powerful and see a good amount of play as such. The Seraphim are essentially Sisters of Battle with jump packs, which allows them to move at a rather fast 12 inches, as well as Deep Strike, which is a rather powerful ability. With the exception of the Squad Superior, who comes with a chainsword, each Seraphim comes equipped with 2 bolt pistols and grenades, which is a rather standard weapon choice. What really makes them interesting is that 2 Seraphims can replace their bolt pistols for either 2 Inferno pistols or 2 hand flamers. The flamers are okay and now have a 12-inch range, which is a nice buff, but they tend to be overshadowed by the much more powerful Inferno pistol. The Inferno pistol is essentially a Melta weapon with a 6-inch range, and having 4 Melta shots out of Deep Strike for under 100 points is a rather frightening ability. More so, the Superior can be given a plasma pistol to add to the amount of special weapon shots they gain, and when put into the Order of the Bloody Rose, they can absolutely shred armored units, because don't forget the Order of the Bloody Rose benefits pistols as well as melee weapons, and you can fire pistol weapons within close combat. There is one small issue though, that the Deep Strike requirement is that you set up 9 inches away from any enemy models, while pistols only have a 6-inch range. To solve this, they have a special stratagem called Deadly Descent, which adds 6 inches to the range after they land from Deep Strike, meaning that they can reach their targets with their pistols even out of Deep Strike, and if they happen to take hand flamers, that gives them a total of 18 inches in range, which is rather interesting. However, you should note that the stratagem occurs when they land, not in the shooting phase, so don't make the mistake of waiting till shooting instead of using it right away as you have to. Additionally, you can do some tricks with it because of the way it's timed, such as potentially using it to clear out a squad and then landing another squad out of Deep Strike now that you can get a little closer without a screening squad in the way. As a whole, considering how light the fast attack options are and how much power the Seraphim can bring to the table for their reasonable points cost, they're definitely a good option in many lists, and you'll oftentimes see people taking them. And remember, as you're only limited to only 2 Seraphims taking those Inferno pistols, you're generally going to take them in minimum squads of 5 as opposed to larger squads, because the bolt pistols themselves aren't that interesting and you really just want to maximize the number of Inferno pistols and potentially plasma pistols that you gain within your army, as otherwise they're rather unimpressive units without the special weapons. Wrapping up, we come to the Dominions, who build out of the basic sister squad box, and as such have the same stat line as a basic sister and cost a tiny bit more in points. They can be given a special weapon, though they cannot take heavy weapons, which isn't too big of a deal as generally you don't want heavy weapons on a squad like this. Usually if you give them anything special, it will be a Melta gun and maybe a Combi Melta on the squad superior. What really lets them stand out though is that they have an ability called Vanguard, which allows them to move their normal movement before the game starts, and that lets them be more proactive while also making them significantly faster than a basic sister for an almost negligible points increase. Though really that's all there is to them. They're basically a standard sister unit with a special movement ability while being in the fast attack slot, which doesn't have much competition. This makes them a rather boring unit, but they're still a playable one that can be good in a list that wants that kind of thing. And to wrap up the video, it does seem like that's the theme of all of these slots. The choices are definitely strong, but they aren't particularly complicated with how they function. This isn't a bad thing as you want your choices to be solid, but it would be good if the troops in fast attack were expanded a little in the future. Even if the Seraphim are a lot of fun to play, it's still nice to have a little bit more variety. None of that is to say this makes Sisters a boring army to play, as they have plenty of choice within other slots in the army and a ton of abilities that take boring picks and elevates them. So while these specific slots aren't the most interesting, we'll see that when we come to the elite choices as well as the heavy support, we definitely see a lot more interesting units emerging there. And there are definitely a lot of different ways to build a Sisters army, though I do hope that in the future we do see more variety in some of these cases. Anyway, if you've enjoyed the content, please like and subscribe as it really does help the channel grow. And as always, have a great day. Bye.